they seemed to be under a blast from heaven; for if we will not allow a visible curse to pursue visible crimes, how shall we reconcile the events of things with the divine justice? It was certainly an apparent vengeance on their crime of mutiny and piracy that brought them to the state they were in, and they showed not the least remorse for the crime, but added new villainies to it, such as the piece of monstrous cruelty of wounding a poor slave because he did not, or perhaps could not, understand to do what he was directed, and to wound him in such a manner as made him a cripple all his life, and in a place where no surgeon or medicine could be had for his cure; and what was still worse, the intentional murder, for such to be sure it was, as was afterwards the formed design they all laid to murder the Spaniards in cold blood, and in their sleep. The three fellows came down to the Spaniards one morning, and in very humble terms desired to be admitted to speak with them. The Spaniards very readily heard what they had to say, which was this: that they were tired of living in the manner they did, and that they were not handy enough to make the necessaries they wanted, and that having no help, they found they should be starved; but if the Spaniards would give them leave to take one of the canoes which they came over in, and give them arms and ammunition proportioned to their defence, they would go over to the main, and seek their fortunes, and so deliver them from the trouble of supplying them with any other provisions. The Spaniards were glad enough to get rid of them, but very honestly represented to them the certain destruction they were running into; told them they had suffered such hardships upon that very spot, that they could, without any spirit of prophecy, tell them they would be starved or murdered, and bade them consider of it. The men replied audaciously, that they should be starved if they stayed here, for they could not work, and would not work, and they could but be starved abroad; and if they were murdered, there was an end of them; they had no wives or children to cry after them; and, in short, insisted importunately upon their demand, declaring they would go, whether they gave them any arms or not. The Spaniards told them, with great kindness, that if they were resolved to go they should not go like naked men, and be in no condition to defend themselves; and that though they could ill spare firearms, not having enough for themselves, yet they would let them have 2 muskets, a pistol and a cutlass, and each man a hatchet, which they thought was sufficient for them. In a word, they accepted the offer; and having baked bread enough to serve them a month given them, and as much goat's flesh as they could eat while it was sweet, with a great basket of dried grapes, a pot of fresh water, and a young kid alive, they boldly set out in the canoe for a voyage over the sea, where it was at least 40 miles broad. The boat, indeed, was a large one, and would very well have carried 15 or 20 men, and therefore was rather too big for them to manage; but as they had a fair breeze and flood tide with them, they did well enough. They had made a mast of a long pole, and a sail of 4 large goat skins dried, which they had sewed or laced together; and away they went merrily together. The Spaniards called after them bon voyage, and no man ever thought of seeing them any more. The Spaniards were often saying to one another, and to the 2 honest Englishmen who remained behind, how quietly and comfortably they lived, now these 3 turbulent fellows were gone. As for their coming again, that was the remotest thing from their thoughts that could be imagined; when, behold, after 22 days' absence, one of the Englishmen being abroad upon his planting work, sees 3 strange men coming towards him at a distance, with guns upon their shoulders. Away runs the Englishman, frightened and amazed, as if he was bewitched, to the governor Spaniard, and tells him they were all undone; for there were strangers upon the island, but he could not tell who they were. The Spaniard, pausing a while, says to him, "How do you mean, you cannot tell who? They are the savages, to be sure." "No, no," says the Englishman, "they are men in clothes, with arms." "Nay, then," says the Spaniard, "why are you so concerned? If they are not savages they must be friends, for there is no Christian nation upon earth but will do us good rather than harm." While they were debating thus, came up the 3 Englishmen, and, standing without the wood, which was new planted, hallooed to them. They presently knew their voices, and so all the wonder ceased; but now the admiration was turned upon another question: what could be the matter, and what made them come back again? It was not long before they brought the men in, and, inquiring where they had been, and what they had been doing, They gave them a full account of their voyage in a few words: that they reached the land in less than 2 days, but finding the people alarmed at their coming, and preparing with bows and arrows to fight them, they durst not go on shore, but sailed on to the northward 6 or 7 hours, till they came to a great opening, by which they perceived that the land they saw from our island was not the main, but an island; that upon entering that opening of the sea they saw another island on the right hand north, and several more west, and being resolved to land somewhere, they put over to one of the islands which lay west, and went boldly on shore; that they found the people very courteous and friendly to them, and they gave them several roots and some dried fish, and appeared very sociable; and that the women, as well as the men, were very forward to supply them with anything they could get for them to eat, and brought it to them a great way on their heads. They continued here for 4 days, and inquired as well as they could of them by signs, what nations were this way and that way, and were told of several fierce and terrible people that lived almost every way, who, as they made known by signs to them, used to eat men; but as for themselves, they said they never ate men or women, except only such as they took in the wars, and then they owned they made a great feast, and ate their prisoners. The Englishmen inquired when they had had a feast of that kind, and they told them about 2 moons ago, pointing to the moon and to 2 fingers, and that their great king had 200 prisoners now, which he had taken in his war, and they were feeding them to make them fat for the next feast. The Englishmen seemed mighty desirous of seeing those prisoners, but the others mistaking them, thought they were desirous to have some of them to carry away for their own eating. So they beckoned to them, pointing to the setting of the sun and then to the rising, which was to signify that the next morning at sunrising they would bring some for them; and accordingly the next morning they brought down 5 women and 11 men, and gave them to the Englishmen to carry with them on their voyage, just as we would bring so many cows and oxen down to a seaport town to victual a ship. As brutish and barbarous as these fellows were at home, their stomachs turned at this sight, and they did not know what to do. To refuse the prisoners would have been the highest affront to the savage gentry that could be offered them, and what to do with them they knew not. However, after some debate they resolved to accept of them, and in return they gave the savages that brought them one of their hatchets, an old key, a knife, and 6 or 7 of their bullets, which, though they did not understand their use, they seemed particularly pleased with; and then tying the poor creatures' hands behind them, they dragged the prisoners into the boat for our men. The Englishmen were obliged to come away as soon as they had them, or else they that gave them this noble present would certainly have expected that they should have gone to work with them, have killed 2 or 3 of them the next morning, and perhaps have invited the donors to dinner. But having taken their leave, with all the respect and thanks that could well pass between people, where on either side they understood not one word they could say, they put off with their boat, and came back towards the first island, where, when they arrived, they set 8 of their prisoners at liberty, there being too many of them for their occasion. In their voyage they endeavoured to have some communication with their prisoners, but it was impossible to make them understand anything. Nothing they could say to them, or give them, or do for them, but was looked upon as going to murder them. They first of all unbound them, but the poor creatures screamed at that, especially the women, as if they had just felt the knife at their throats; for they immediately concluded they were unbound on purpose to be killed. If they gave them a thing to eat, it was the same thing; they then concluded it was for fear they should sink in flesh, and so not be fat enough to kill. If they looked at one of them more particularly, the party presently concluded it was to see whether he or she was fattest, and fittest to kill first; nay, after they had brought them quite over, and began to use them kindly, and treat them well, still they expected every day to make a dinner or supper for their new masters. When the 3 wanderers had given this unaccountable history or journal of their voyage, the Spaniard asked them where their new family was; and being told that they had brought them on shore, and put them into one of their huts, and were come up to beg some victuals for them, they, the Spaniards, and the other 2 Englishmen, that is to say the whole colony, resolved to go all down to the place and see them; and did so, and Friday's father with them. When they came into the